This is that INFJ who you look over in the office and their cubicle or their desk looks like everybody else's. And then you look down and you notice they're like wearing like red Chuck Taylor shoes or something.
Yeah.
Like, there's like a little flare, but most of it's normal. And they're like, wait, that's not a normal person, but everything seems normal about them.
Yeah.
Right? That's this INFJ, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I remember working in an accounting department about 1 million years ago, and I worked with somebody who I was fairly certain was an INFJ. And one of the reasons, or one of the things that tipped me off is that, like you said, everything else was identical, except that she had like 20 different glasses frames. And every single day she'd change to a different frame. And it was just this little bit of communication that said, I'm not like you. Like, don't think I'm like you, even though I'm coming to the same accounts payable, job.
Yeah. Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So today on the show, we're talking about INFJ careers. Now, you might be an INFJ listening along or watching this show, and this is about you and your careers, or you might have an INFJ in your life that you care about and you're listening or watching right now to get some insight into how INFJs approach careers. The topic of careers has come up for us in Antonia. We are in the midst of doing what we call our Personality Life Path Mentorship. We're getting a group of people together and going over each of the Jungian cognitive functions and the archetypical energies that those functions represent in the world. We're taking all 8, and we're taking 8 weeks to go into each one of them week by week, giving our students assignments to go in the real world, see how this energy of this function shows up for them, like archetypically, but also for them in their personality type and the people around them, and really tap into the relationship they have to that function. And then at the end, we're going to have a live event where we tie it all together for a life path for their personality. We got people from all different types, not just INFJs, joining this program. But most people that are part of this program are going through a transition. They're going through a life transition. They're going through a relationship transition. I would say the most common transition, though, is a career transition. Right now, a lot of people at the time of this recording are thinking about, what do I really want to be doing in my life? Am I in the right career? Should I be going for this other career? What's my vocation? How am I going to put my time and attention to the things that I want to do in the world in a career fashion? So we want to talk about that today. And if you're an INFJ listening, we're not going to come from a topical approach, although we'll talk about specific careers INFJs might choose. We're going to talk about this from a principle level approach and the flavors of INFJs that lend themselves to different types of careers. So let's get into this.
Yeah. So a part of how we'll be discussing this is hearkening to our friend Dr. Dario Nardi's work that he's been doing over the last couple of years on subtypes. There is an entire podcast that we recorded with Dario, I can't remember how long ago, where he discusses this subtype theory and how it emerged using EEG scans and noticing that even within the same type, there was slightly different brain patterns, right? Brain wiring patterns. Yeah. And how that ended up really interfacing or sort of colliding with like socionic subtypes. In fact, the names that he has for these 4 subtypes are borrowed with permission from Dr. Victor Galenko, who works in subtypes, in socionics. Yeah. And also Dr. Helen Fisher's work in neurotransmitters. There's some crossover there too.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about this subtype work is that a part of how he noticed that they existed at all, or the first pattern that started to emerge, was that certain career paths were creating certain subtypes, or at least influencing them.
Yeah.
And he realized that at the age of 25 and after, your career has the most influence on how your type shows up. And he put them into these 4 different subtypes. So the conversation around careers and type isn't just what is a good career for my type to go into. It's how do I want my type to evolve over time? Because the career path I choose is going to be a major influence on that.
So we're talking about Dr. Nardi, who brought people into his laboratory knowing their type. So you're an INFJ. He had INFJs come in. He connected a bunch of INFJs and other types as well to EEG machines and watch the brain patterns show up based on their cognition. He'd give them different exercises and watch the brain patterns form. And he noticed a pattern of 4 different brain configurations for INFJs that have this style, the expression. It's basically a different expression of the INFJ mind. And this correlates, like you said, with neurotransmitters and basically gives us an indicator of not only maybe the aptitude or the type of career you as an INFJ would want to choose, but when you do choose a career, it starts to feedback. You're saying feedback and influence the flavoring of your INFJ nature, the style or the way you show up as an INFJ in the world.
Right. So there does seem to be evidence that indicates that your best fit type is pre-wired, meaning that we're born with it. But the flavor of your type, your subtype in this case, is actually something that is more nurture influenced than nature. And so a part of this too is that you're not stuck in any one subtype. Depending upon your context and your influences and the lifestyle choices you make, you can actually go from one subtype to another. In fact, I think Dario said that he was really reluctant to use the word subtype because he didn't want people thinking that they were hedged in or they were stuck in this this flavor or variety.
Yeah.
I think he was going to originally use the word variant, but that kind of got messed up. And variant has a different meaning now. So he decided to go with the term subtype, even though he was reluctant because of that idea that we're stuck there. But it's important to understand that because it's nurture oriented, again, as I mentioned, the career you choose isn't just what is good for you, right? Or what you will enjoy. It's also, what do I want influencing me 40 plus hours a week to become a certain kind of person with certain kinds of, different mental processing capacities.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that deeper stuff, let's consult the internet. What does the internet say? If you were to go and do a search as an INFJ, what's a top 10 list from the internet? So I just did this is not like super deep work. I just did a casual search and compiled a list of 10 commonly held ideas for INFJs and careers. So here is the top 10 INFJ career choices according to the internet. Number 1, counselor, psychologist, or therapist. Number 2, social worker, nonprofit professional. 3, writer, author. 4, teacher, educator. 5, human resource manager, recruiter. 6, artist or designer. 7, religious or spiritual leader. 8, healthcare professional, like a nurse, doctor, something like that. 9, lawyer or mediator. Number 10, management consultant or organizational developer. Sounds like INFJs can literally do anything. Like they have a really wide breadth of options in front of them. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there does seem to be a lot of variety, but I would say that certain subtypes are more attracted to careers on that list than other subtypes would be. Or rather, choosing that career path might end up creating or determining your subtype.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing because not every INFJ is going to be interested in every one of those career paths. The other thing is, I do want to make a note that if you are new to type, this particular episode we want to design it so that even if you're brand new and you just discovered you have INFJ preferences or you're just playing around with the idea, we want to make this accessible. And so we're not going to make it, we're not going to turn this into something that's so technical that you won't be able to follow along. But if you are super into type and a type geek, we'll have some of that jargon in there as well. So for the newbies, when we're about to go into geeky tech jargon, we'll go ahead and give you a warning that that's where we're headed.
So the 4 subtypes for the INFJ are called dominant, creative, normalizing, and harmonizing. So let's just walk through these now. Let's start with the dominant. The dominant subtype for INFJ. What does this look like?
So this INFJ is going to be a lot more bold than I think than it is oftentimes in our head that an INFJ looks like. In fact, this INFJ might even mistype as an ENFJ or some other extroverted type. Some of the characteristics is that they're outspoken, even daring. They're willing to ruffle feathers, which is not usually associated with the INFJ type. They are strong, thoughtful. They deeply attend to values, although they're going to ruffle these feathers in as eloquent a way as possible. There's still that component to an INFJ that when they're communicating things that might sound a little off-standing, they're going to try to cushion the blow if they can. They can be smooth managers. They can grow if they choose to do so. They can grow into paragons of emotional intelligence, which they use to manage relationships. There's still a diplomacy there, even though there is a more daringly outspoken nature to them. Now, that idea of daring is going to be relative to the type. So if we're putting them against, say, ESTP types, the daring is not going to look the same, right? This is daring for the type. And that assertiveness gives them capacity to really sort of take chances. This is an INFJ that's going to take a little bit more chances and risks than others of the subtype. They have strong auditory skills, so they're attracted to things that allow them to put things in spoken or written word to their best effect. So they're going to have really strong language skills. In fact, most of the subtypes are tapped into language pretty strong, and they're reflective thinkers. And so there is a lot more. Part of the boldness is the fact that they not just take risks. Actually, the boldness is more that they act faster than the other subtypes. But a part of the reason why they're able to have a faster reaction time than their other counterparts is because they take time to do this reflective thinking. They've almost like pre-thought out how they would respond when they get to those situations.
Almost sounds like a perceiver in a way.
Almost.
A little bit of the preloading in the brain. Would you say, as we're building this map of these 4 subtypes, my guess is the others are going to really lend themselves to writing more? Of all of the 4 subtypes, I bet you auditorially or articulation-wise, this is the most likely to be able to podcast or extemporaneously speak, get up on stage and just lead a group or articulate using their voice, not just the written word.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. When we get to creative, that's more visual. Normalizing is going to be a little bit more sort of quiet. And then by the time we get to harmonizing, that's the one that's probably the least associated with asserting verbal skills. So yeah, this is the kind that's more likely to do things like podcasting, etc.
Great.
So we talked about them taking chances, and a part of that also with the verbal capacity is enjoying an audience. This is an INFJ that actually likes to be in front of a camera or in front of a microphone, and they like to stay engaged in the world, right? This is a more assertive quality. So you could almost say that these INFJs have an audacious quality, not in comparison to maybe other types, but definitely in comparison to their other INFJ subtypes. And they're able to do this even when they're internally nervous. So it's not like they don't care. It's just that they're able to overcome their nervousness in order to be in front of an audience. Sometimes they can look a little brittle, right? Vulnerable and brittle, but there is a strength of character that helps them get through that. The challenge is that because they have that sort of assertiveness, and that can look like calling people out or being, or critiquing others, trying to stay really true to those values that are important to them. The cost is that every once in a while they might have a depression that comes out of nowhere and they're not 100% sure how to deal with that. That said, the careers that they find themselves attracted to, or possibly the careers that have helped them become this subtype, is advising, educators, leaders, managers, teachers. They definitely like to take a more central lead in most of their relationships, maybe even romantic relationships or family or community. They really enjoy putting themselves in a leadership position, particularly if they see evidence that it's helping, the people around them.
Yeah. And from a chemical standpoint or neurotransmitter standpoint, testosterone, there's a relationship with testosterone for this subtype, which would make sense. A little more assertive, a little more directive, a little more initiative. And let's talk a little bit for the type geeks. How does the cognition look? The cognitive functions INFJs are using, introverted intuition or perspectives is the driver or dominant. The co-pilot or auxiliary is extroverted feeling harmony.
Right. Okay. So for the type geeks, the way that it works is both your perceiving and your judging function, like you mentioned, Joel, in this case, introverted intuition and extroverted feeling, both of them will have a more assertive quality. This is called the analytic version. So each cognitive function has a more assertive analytic direction it can take, or a more holistic receiving energy it can take. Meaning that, all of us have the capacity to output and input. For dominant subtypes, their preference is to use both of their functions as often as they can, get away with it, in the more analytic, assertive energy. They're more outputting with their functions than they are preferring to input with them. And that's what creates the dominant subtype.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got dominant INFJs. We still have creative, normalizing, harmonizing to cover. Let's bounce over to creative. What does a creative INFJ subtype look like?
These INFJs are a little more bohemian. In fact, I would say that this is a picture that a lot of people have in their minds around INFJs, although this might be the type that has the hardest time determining if they're INFPs or INFJs.
Yes.
There's a bit of, there's a curiosity, imagination, there is a love of perpetual learning, and these INFJs are oftentimes well-traveled because there is that sort of thirst for, really what they're doing is they're looking for things to fuel their creativity. It's an INFJ that's tapped into the power of flow and looking for a lot of things to channel muses effectively. And because of that, these INFJs feel like sponges. They soak up everything. And there's a highly intuitive creative mind in there. Now, unlike the dominant INFJ, this subtype might struggle with doing day-to-day tasks, with living a more mundane life. They might be the more head in the clouds version of an INFJ. But when they are on, they're on. There's a lot of different connections that are being made. In fact, this might be why they could sometimes mistype as INFPs, because there's an ability to sort of take everything that they've been accumulating and learning and understanding and connect it all together to create some sort of have a creative outlet around it. There is, though, a on or off switch sort of feel about this INFJ. When they're on, they are super on. But when this INFJ is having trouble channeling a muse or really getting into their creativity, they might feel blocked. They might even feel lazy because there's not as much capacity to just kind of push forward and make it happen anyway. They're more at the whim of their creative flow. There is a lot of dense auditory links in the brain scans, meaning that they are also very tapped into auditory things like language, but they tend to light up more or less with language and more with music.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you're in that creative flow, that effortless flow that this creative subtype is having, where the dominant has to be more articulate. Like, here's what I want in the world, and asserting almost ideas out there. It sounds like the creative, it wants to get in the flow, the music of life, metaphorically and literally, the music of life. Be creative, be in the flow of that creativity. Let things emerge, but in a creative way, and bring them forward to others. Right.
And what's interesting is that the more they have an ear for music, the more they can tap into abstract concept like metaphor and humor.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's like it's waking up their auditory piece, but it's more associated with music that then gives them these images and these understandings. It's kind of like all INFJs have a relationship to language, but this is more likely to be a visual INFJ. And so the auditory thing that kicks up might even be more channeled towards a visual, like a visual medium than it would just, pure language like you're talking about.
Yeah. I am already thinking of a friend of mine who's an INFJ that's exactly this subtype.
Right.
So careers, what jobs would this style of INFJ lend itself to?
So because they're going to have difficulty with, say, things like more mundane tasks, right? They're not as assertive energy as the dominant INFJ. This INFJ is a little more trying to feed the muse. They can look scattered. They can have challenges just buckling down. And so they're going to need a career that suits that, or at least helps them, or accommodates for that sort of idiosyncrasy. So there's a lot of these styles of INFJs in the creative arts, right? Particularly music, as you can imagine. They're usually very into travel. And so they might do something that is associated with travel, allows them to sort of collect that information all the time because there's a constant thirst for information. There's also a capacity for foreign languages, right? So they might find something that allows them to learn and utilize foreign languages. Of course, the arts are filled with these kinds of INFJs. But when they do that, it's more likely to be, something around jazz or, something that's more improvisation than it is with like the classics and memorizing classical music or pieces of art. And they can also be attracted to the sciences, actually, as long as whatever they venture into gives them that capacity to seek their own style within that. And of course, they can be very enthusiastic teachers.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like our profiler training event a couple months ago. I was walking out in the lobby after one of the sessions on like the fourth day, and there was a group of students playing with our profiling cards and developing like games, like gameplay. And I believe that one of the INFJs that was sitting there probably lends herself to a creative style INFJ. She was coming with a lot of new concepts on how this would play. It was very free form, in the moment, emergent kind of energy. And it was really interesting. I think that was an expression of that. The other thing I would say here too is so if you're an INFJ and you're looking, if you feel more like the creative subtype, you're probably not going to go get a 9-to-5 job at a desk in an office. Or if you do, you might suffer a lot. Like you might hate that. I think most creative subtypes, and we talk about this other types as well, but I think this lends itself to INFJs in the same fashion. If you're a creative INFJ, having a platform you can rest on top of and be independent in your creativity is probably a really great option for you. For example, I think YouTube is a great platform. If you're an INFJ and want to express through music or video or whatever, YouTube is a platform, for example, that enables you to be creative without having to worry about all the logistics and red tape and all the, the business side of it or whatever. And so finding some kind of a platform or being subsidized with some entity that can support you in your creative endeavors is probably the thing you want to move toward if this is your style. Whereas like the dominant, it's more like go start your own business, go get that leadership role. It's more of a different attunement of energy. But the creative, I think that platform thinking is really beneficial here.
Yeah, and gives you a lot of capacity to learn.
Yes.
Like there's a
Explore,
thirst.
learn, grow. Yeah.
There's a thirst for knowledge that particularly creative INFJs have. So anything that allows them constantly be learning, and they can teach or they can, use it in different ways. But the career path you choose has to give you just like tons of information because that's part of how you get your muse going.
Yeah. From neurotransmitter standpoint, dopamine is the chemical relationship that this subtype often has. Type geeks out there, let's talk about the cognitive wiring, the two cognitive functions of introverted intuition and extroverted feeling.
Okay, so for the type geeks, there is the perceiving function, in this case, introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives. The perceiving function is going to be the analytic or the output function, right? It's going to be more assertive. It's going to have an energy and a will. It's going to, and that makes sense, like the creative part, right? The intuitive part is going to be the part that wants to assert itself to the world. But the judging function, in this case, extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, that's going to be more holistic. It's going to have a more receptive energy, or sort of, it's more being responsive than it is setting an agenda. And so because of that, that's one of the reasons why this style of INFJ struggles to do mundane tasks, because the judging function is the one that says, well, I should be doing this, and this is how the world should be constructed. And if that is a more receiving energy than an assertive energy, then you're going to have less certain statements around that. You're going to be a little bit more open-ended, even in that judging function.
It also might mean you struggle a little bit more with the things that function does well, like setting boundaries, knowing where you and another person stop. Like you might have to work on those elements a little bit more if you're this style of INFJ. All right, so we've talked about dominant, creative. Let's talk about the normalizing INFJ subtype. So what does a normalizing INFJ look like?
So the normalizing is the opposite of the creative. And normalizing are going to be, their brain patterns look a little bit more typical of the general population. But even with that said, they're still INFJs, and that means that they're going to still have quirky brain wiring. Now, that's the interesting thing about the INFJ personality type just in general, is no matter which subtype they do things just a little differently than even like the other subtypes that are like them. Does that make sense? Because there's like a normalizing subtype of all 16 types.
Yeah. And
there tends to be a pretty consistent pattern with all the normalizing subtypes, except for INFJs that have this weird zigzag pattern. So INFJs are they're just always a little quirky, right? And I suspect that's one of the reasons why they get into type, is because they're like, why am I so weird, right? Like I feel like I'm almost like everybody else, but not quite.
Well, if you're an INFJ listening right now, you're like, yes, exactly what she said. Yeah. I'm a weirdo. Even the normal part of me is a weirdo.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's always a challenge with like sort of pandering to INFJs online and telling them that they're the greatest and they're all saints. But I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if you feel like you're a weirdo, there's brain scan technology that says, yeah, you're kind of a weirdo. Even when you're normal, you're still kind of a bit of a weirdo, which means that there's a high population of INFJs that seek type information to try to explain what's going on.
That's right.
So this is going to be a more mainstream style of INFJ, but the mainstream aspect feels like a costume. right? It doesn't quite feel 100% them because they have this interesting zigzag pattern that happens, which isn't just particular or peculiar to INFJs. It's peculiar to the INFJ themselves, right? It's like even your normalizing zigzag pattern is going to look different than another normalizing INFJ zigzag pattern.
This is that INFJ who you look over in the office and their cubicle or their desk looks like everybody else's. And then you look down and you notice they're like wearing like red Chuck Taylor shoes or something.
Yeah.
Like, there's like a little flare, but most of it's normal. And they're like, wait, that's not a normal person, but everything seems normal about them.
Yeah.
Right? That's this INFJ, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I remember working in an accounting department about 1 million years ago, and I worked with somebody who I was fairly certain was an INFJ. And one of the reasons, or one of the things that tipped me off is that, like you said, everything else was identical, except that she had like 20 different glasses frames. And every single day she'd change to a different frame. And it was just this little bit of communication that said, I'm not like you. Like, don't think I'm like you, even though I'm coming to the same accounts payable, job.
Yeah.
I'm just a little different. So this INFJ, unlike the creative subtype, which kind of struggles a little bit with like mundane tasks and might look like they're having trouble getting their act together, this INFJ is the exact opposite. They actually have... Dario says good, even remarkable self-management skills. So they're actually very good at attending to the mundane things.
Remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a self-conscious emotional intelligence that they bring. And like all INFJs, they're going to be tapped into an auditory piece, which is associated with language. But this is going to be more direct access to language as opposed to the creative, which is more like music oriented, right? And that's what gets their visualizations going. This is going to be more direct language and writing things like reports, right?
The written word,
right.
more than auditory, like vocalizing language. This INFJ subtype of normalizing is most likely going to focus in on writing well, grammar, sentence structure, things like that.
Right. And when I say self-conscious emotional intelligence, I mean something that feels important to them. Like they're self-aware of it. And when they're applying it, even if they're using this language capacity, say, write technical reports or, like a report to, for their department or whatever, it's still going to have meaning to it. And it's still going to seem like it's important that they put in, thoughts and visualizations and that sort of thing.
So I'm also guessing this INFJ lends themselves toward things like mathematics, middle management, anything that requires like quiet computational thought, like by themselves without engaging with a lot of people. Does that track on this subtype here, or would the dominant be more mathematically inclined?
No, actually, the one thing that stands out about this particular subtype of INFJs is their endurance. Right? They're just able to plug along with anything they apply themselves to. And so these are the INFJs that do very well in school. They do very well in their careers, usually. They're the ones who have like the engineering degrees, right?
Yeah.
If they want to apply it to math, they certainly can. But they're the ones who are going to they'll get their doctorates. They'll get their engineering degrees. He even mentions that if they have a terrible illness, they're the ones that persevere through their terrible illness. They... really, as long as they have a clear, compelling goal, they are the most steady INFJ towards reaching it.
Yeah.
And so it can be applied to literally anything they want to. Usually, though, as with normalizing subtypes, it's in an institution or a traditional practice with clear metrics. There has to be a compelling, clear goal at the other side. And oftentimes what they'll use to sort of, feel like markers along the way is if they get a little prestige, that feels good, right? If they get a pat on the head or sort of like a lot of recognition on the way up, which they tend to do because they're so good at what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they can really sort of emphasize that piece of meaning so that if they're not getting prestige, then the other thing that they can link these goals to is, a direct link towards helping others with Dario calls a warm passion for it.
So I want to create a little distinction here. You can help me work on this. When you said goal setting or the goals they want to go toward, I immediately think in terms of the dominant INFJ that sets goals, goes for leadership to achieve those goals. Could we say maybe normalizing, obviously there's goals, like low-level goals people want to go toward, But could we maybe reframe that and say the expectations they're going toward, like the expectations that are set up in front of them, the expectations of people around them, the expectations of their career or their job performance, rather than a specific, like, I want to go start a business and then sell it to another company, and that's my goal in life, which would maybe be more of a dominant INFJ style.
Well, I would say that, dominant and normalizing are actually more similar to each other than, say, normalizing and creative.
Sure.
So dominant and normalizing are going to have some crossover. And a dominant INFJ's goals might be more impact. Like they're trying to make something, like they're trying to bring themselves into having an impact on the world. For this INFJ, it's more specific goals, right? Like to get to the other side of something. And the reason why they have such, like Dario says that they have remarkable, what does he call it? That they have remarkable self-management skills.
Yeah.
In part is because when they run out of steam in one area, like maybe their inspiration or their motivation kind of ran out of steam, they're very good at finding another thing to light them up. Meaning that the self-management piece is because they they just go, okay, well, I guess this is not going to be my inspiration. I guess I'm going to have to find another inspiration and go with that. Yeah. So it is actually more directly goal-oriented. Whereas the dominant subtype, remember, the downside is that sometimes every once in a while, a lack of inspiration hits them and then they go into a depression. And they're not sure where it came from, and now they're out for the count, and they have to get to the other side of that. So a dominant INFJ might have like more of a scaled, assertive impact, right? Personal impact on the world, but they're going to have less consistency. Whereas the normalizing INFJ is going to have a lot more sort of chip away, consistent capacity to get to the goal.
So multiple things are coming up for me for this particular INFJ flavoring or subtype. One is, this is probably the subtype that mistypes themselves, like as an INTP, for example, or maybe even an ISFJ. Mm-hmm. Like their different types might come out. The real head-focused, quiet INFJ that's like, no, I'm an INTP. I'm all about the numbers and the logic. Maybe this style lends itself to that more.
Yeah, I would say probably INTJ as well.
INTJ, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is the type that thinks they're an
Thinker.
INTJ, mm-hmm, or possibly even an ISTJ. Every once in a while, that weirdly happens.
Yeah.
But yes, they're going to. They are more likely to mistype as sensors or thinkers.
And I would also argue that of all the subtypes so far we've talked about, and we're going to talk about harmonizing in a moment here, but this one stands out to me because I think society, like the world, the system of the world that's set up, like Western culture and like the way we've constructed business and career, it wants everybody to be boxed into this normalizing subtype. Like it wants every type to show up as a normalizing, because that's, if you're working in a business, that's easy to control people and keep them in boxes and manage them. If everybody's doing their job, doing it well, not being creative, not trying to be dominant or take over, they just do their work, have your goals, do your thing. And because INFJs tend to, they have that extroverted feeling or harmony co-pilot, auxiliary function, they do want to play nice with others. So I think there's a natural landing that INFJs might find themselves here, even though it may not be natural to them. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is you might be an INFJ listening along. You might be in a career right now. It's a very normalizing career, right? You show up and you do your job and you're in that. You may hate it because it's not giving you the creative outlet. It's not letting you show off your dominant side of the way you can take charge in the world. But you feel like, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to step out. And you said something that's really important, Antonia. This INFJ can keep going, meaning this subtype has figured out how to manage energy and invulnerability. Like the vulnerability they show up with and the energy they show up with, both of those are managed at this subtype, which makes an INFJ relax. If I can manage my energy, I know I've got enough energy, and I know I'm not going to be vulnerable to the outside world, I feel very good as an INFJ. So again, you might be an INFJ that's more creative, but if that solves those two problems for you, you might find yourself in a career that you may not be really fitting, but the energy piece and the vulnerability piece is taken care of. So I'm just offering this, if you're an INFJ tracking yourself through this, just to be self-aware and say, oh yeah, maybe I'm in this role more because of what it gives me than it is naturally wired for me.
Yeah. Each of these subtypes, this is, again, nurture, not nature.
Exactly.
And so I think what you're trying to say, Joel, is that a person doesn't have to be stuck here.
That's right.
That said, there's a lot of advantages to being a normalizing subtype.
Oh, yeah.
And not just that the world, pats you on the head and you want to play nicey nice. Like you said, the advantage to being a normalizing INFJ is that you have figured out how to just keep going. And the advantage to being a dominant INFJ is that, your values get to be more, you get to have more of an impact on the world with your personal values and the way that you think things should be set up.
Yeah.
You get a little bit more of a voice. You have less fear, right? There's like a courage to the dominant INFJ, but then there's that like every once in a while depression smacks you and you just now have to deal with that. For the creative INFJ, you get to be expressive and constantly learning and bohemian and traveling. And there's all sorts of great stuff that comes with that. But then you struggle to just do day-to-day life and figure that piece out. And then when the muse is gone, you don't know if you can get it back. For the normalizing INFJ, yeah, you don't have that cool bohemian thing going on necessarily. And you don't have that like push my will out to the world thing. But man, are you steady. And so there's a lot of advantages to that. And, if you want to, I think what you're suggesting too, Joel, is that if a person is attracted to other subtypes, those are available. But man, if you found your lane with normalizing, nothing wrong with that.
I'm not downing the normalizing. Clearly you can tell I have an aversion to be normalizing of my subtype or my expression of my personality type. That's just how I'm wired. But I think all of these are valid, like you said. Mm-hmm. And I think, thank you for stopping here and just spending a little bit more time on this, because I do think a lot of INFJs find themselves here. Mm-hmm. And again, there's opportunities all different directions for you. And you can also see a map of maturity going through this too. Like some people early in life are one subtype expression, and then as they mature and grow, maybe they start to lean into some of the other ways their functions and their personality can express. Okay. The chemical for normalizing INFJs is serotonin. Mm-hmm. That's the chemical of choice, or the one that they have a relationship with. And let's talk a little bit. We haven't covered the functions, the geek function level.
Yeah.
For the type geeks out there. Let's talk about that, and then we're going to bump over to harmonizing.
Okay. So for the type geeks, this is the opposite of the creative. So in this case, the perceiving function, introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives, that would be the holistic function. So that's more input, receptive energy. It's less assertive output. It's more kind of taking in information. And the judging function of extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony, that would be the analytic or the more output energy. And you can see that. You can see when our perceiving function is holistic and takes information in, we're a little bit more impressionable to the messages of society around us, right? We're kind of like, oh, this is how reality works, I guess. And that's part of why there is more capacity to align with society and be a little bit more normalizing. And then that capacity to just keep going, right? That judging function, which is the assertive, like things should be done in a certain way and I've got to do that and I've just got to make it happen. That makes sense that judging function would be the more analytic or output function. But again, even with a normalizing INFJ, there's still going to be interesting, unique brain wiring that is individual to them.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the final subtype for INFJs, harmonizing. What does a harmonizing INFJ look like?
All right, so these are, I think actually, interestingly enough, most of the time with most types, the harmonizing is a subtype that people don't even know exists. They don't see people as, like particularly we recently recorded the episode on ESTPs.
Yeah. And
when we talked about the ESTP subtype or a harmonizing subtype, it's like you could tell that these are people who probably mistyped themselves as intuitives and feelers all over the place. We just don't think of that as an ESTP subtype. But I would say that the harmonizing INFJ subtype might be everybody's image in their mind of an INFJ.
The stereotype.
This is the stereotype. Yeah, it's really fascinating. But I think INFJs are always like, they're just kind of topsy-turvy in most things that have to do with brain wiring. So this is the far-seeing, the philosophical, the poetic, the spiritual, the ethereal INFJ.
The sage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. These are the sophisticated, unique INFJs as well. And
wait, the others are unsophisticated? Is that what you're saying?
Well, Dario mentions that it is not uncommon to start with the more assertive versions when we're young, particularly creative or dominant. And harmonizing INFJs are clustered later in life. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes we can be raised, or an INFJ could be raised to be the harmonizing subtype from a young age. And if that's the case, they're not going to get all the benefits of it being something, a subtype that the INFJ has grown into. So some of that language of like the sophisticated INFJ is going to be a harmonizing INFJ later in life, not one that just gets to have that. But this is more the INFJ that we're thinking of, like the sage-like, sophisticated, sort of spiritual, in tune INFJ.
Yeah.
And they also have that zigzag pattern, like the normalizing. But then they have another sort of specialized way of interacting, which is the thing that's common to harmonizing. So they, as usual, they're attentive to voice tonality, right? They're very tuned into language. They are tuned into narratives, symbols, visual patterns, and social feedback, right? They're looking for a lot of social feedback with that second function. But they're not as adept at language as other INFJs are. Interestingly enough, they're the ones that sort of struggle to communicate more than the other subtypes do. And even more so than the creatives. Like the creative subtypes will still, all they need is a little bit of auditory perk up, and then they can get into communicating and expressing. This INFJ is tuned into it, but they're not as good at communicating what's going on inside their mind as the other subtype. So they have a little bit of a deficiency there. And in fact, they also can kind of struggle to do day-to-day life. Just like the creative subtype, they can kind of they sort of struggle to fit into society and interface with it and aren't 100% sure how to communicate. That said, they can choose any profession, but advising other people, that is this subtype's name of the game. This is the thing that they do the best, is advising. And so careers like counseling, healthcare, mystical or shamanistic arts, they are very good at understanding cross-cultural components, and they're extremely good at holding multiple points of view with a detachment. So they're really good at observing and seeing a complex system of interacting perspectives without it taking it personally at all, and then being able to advise another person. So obviously, therapist is up there, psychologist is up there, and anything that really needs that capacity to be able to see that bigger picture and to advise another person on how to navigate through it.
So this is much more of a responsive, taking the needs that are around them, open INFJ to the energy. Meaning, I would also then posit, we could say they're probably the most vulnerable of all the four subtypes to outside energies assaulting them.
Yes, I would actually say that the challenge, the disadvantage, other than just kind of trying to figure out how to interface with society, the challenge is that they can look passive. Right? Yeah. This is part of the challenge of communicating, sort of their ideas, the struggle with that. There's a passivity to this type. And so because of that, they really prefer to work one-on-one with people, or even solo, right? By themselves, away from others, or just one-to-one, or to be somebody who is, sort of brought in as a revered guest to communicate and then move on. Yeah, there's not, unlike the dominant, and this is actually the opposite of the dominant subtype, there's no love of an audience, right? There's almost like a reticence to be in front of an audience.
Yeah. So I can imagine if you find yourself leaning more toward the harmonizing INFJ, if you're an INFJ listening, you may want to attach yourself to people who can, not a little bit different than the creative with a platform thinking, where you're going to get on YouTube and create your videos. You might want to find some people you trust that can continue to put you in front of people that need your services. In other words, maybe you are a coach or a counselor in a larger organization, and the organization and the people that are leaderships, in the leadership there, identify your talents, and they can keep bringing you clients or work that you can be your best self around. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's a people-focused strategy for you to find career options. Your network is probably very important, being a harmonizing subtype, maybe even more than the other three, because the people you tend to work with, they have to know your value, because you're probably not going to be the type that's going to continue to put yourself out there. Like, I'm really valuable. Look at how much value I can bring. You need an advocate that can almost market you or talk about how valuable you are and get the clients or get the work or get the energy to you so you can do your best work with them.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That'd be my strategy to an INFJ that leans this direction.
Yeah, there's such a subtlety to this subtype that it's going like you're going to have to be in a context that appreciates those little things.
Yeah.
And there's also just like the creative subtype where like go do something that allows you to constantly and perpetually learn. This is a subtype that I would say find something that allows you to stay connected to something esoteric or spiritual.
Yeah.
Like find something that allows you to be appreciated and in something that's more of the sort of the subtleties of the deeper connections with others and walking them through an experience or sort of really understanding the depth of another person. Like if you are a therapist, you might have to be one of those that is word of mouth that everybody's like, they're amazing. What do they do? I can't even explain it. It was incredible. Go do it. And so it's more in that vein.
Yeah.
Now, again, let's talk about the geeky part.
Yeah. Well, so I'm just going to say the chemical
Oh.
neurotransmitter is estrogen for this subtype.
Yes.
And let's talk about the functions. How are they attuned?
Okay, so for the type geeks out there, this is the opposite of the dominant. So both of the functions, both introverted intuition and extroverted feeling, they're going to be holistic. It's input, it's receptive. That's why it appears to be passive. That's why it's subtle. It's got a more diffused energy in it. And that's one of the reasons why this subtype, this INFJ subtype shies away from the public light, shies away from being on stage, and will be probably the one that looks the most hesitant to put themselves out there. Now, what's important to remember is that we are not locked into any of these subtypes. If there's something about your subtype that you wish were a little different, you have access to the other subtypes to wake up that part of your personality. So if you are, say, a holistic, INFJ, and you wish you had more assertive qualities, the creative version is available to you. You can start to build a more analytic version of that introverted intuition, or I would say put yourself in positions of, say, performance or doing things that kind of put you out there a little bit more, and that'll wake up the creative subtype version. Or you also have the normalizing available to you. And you could go towards more of a steadiness, sort of more of an assertive kind of figure out how to just stay inspired and just keep going and going and going in a more sort of traditional context, like a 9-to-5 job. So again, it's not just that you're looking for careers that suit you and your subtype. You're looking for careers that will help you become the kind of person you want to become. So if you choose a career that is suited for a certain subtype that isn't yours, it is likely to wake those aspects of yourself up. Now, it might not be easy, right? It might take a little bit of growth and development and might be tough, but it will help you grow into the kind of person you want to be. So it's really about figuring out that sort of center of the Venn diagram of a career that suits me and a career that allows me to grow into these different skills and capacities that the other subtypes offer.
I'm going to make a quick comment, a little bit deeper content here, in case you're an INFJ listening or watching along that has some more advanced attunement to personality types. I'll just say this, and this is just for those INFJs. So there's some things you can do to pay attention to the energies you attune yourself to around yourself. So as an example, the harmonizing INFJs tend to seek out and play well with other types, both their own and other types that are dominant subtypes. Those two energies do well together. Just like I said, if you're a harmonizing INFJ, you might want to seek out somebody that can help put you forward, market you, talk about your skills and all of that. That works together in tandem really well. And that's a unique arrangement between the dominant subtypes and the harmonizing subtypes. Because when we get to the creative subtypes, they tend to not want to be around other subtypes of their own type or others. They tend to hang around other creatively wired people that are of that subtype. Same thing with the normalizing. Normalizing likes to stay with normalizing. Creative likes to stay with creative. But dominant and harmonizing both like each other. They like to connect to each other and stay kind of in a containment. So if you find yourself in one of those, if you're a dominant, you might want to look for other energies that are more harmonizing. If you're harmonizing, you might want to look for more energies that are dominant. If you're creative, be careful that you don't just find other creative subtype people of all flavors. And if you're normalizing, be careful you don't just have friends and people you associate with that are all normalizing, because you tend to want to cluster together in those groups. That's just a trend. It's not a rule. But those are some things to pay attention to and just be mindful of. If you're somebody that understands type at the level we've talked about so far, That's a little bit more advanced material that hopefully we can talk about in a future episode and unpack. There's a bunch of reasons why that is. We can talk about that in the future.
Yeah.
Did that make sense, by the way?
Yeah.
I know I started that off in a little bit of a convoluted. I found my way there through conversation. So hopefully that made sense in how I articulated that. So the other thing to also keep in mind is these are flexible. You can move in and out of them. I like to use the metaphor of a song. If the written musical notes on the paper is the song that is INFJ, the way that song is performed is the subtype. So obviously, if Rage Against the Machine performs a song, it's going to sound much different than Lady Gaga performing a song, even though the musical notes on the paper might be the same. Those are two different expressions of the same possible song. And so these subtypes are an expression of the INFJ personality type. They are not a type in and of themselves.
Or like Johnny Cash covering a Tool song.
Exactly.
Right. It's like the same notes, the same words, but a totally different interpretation.
I would also say there's a maturity aspect to this. Like we go through a maturation process in life. And you mentioned like a lot of people start out with more dominant energy when they're younger, which would make sense. We're looking for our friend circles, our career, mating opportunities. We have to put ourselves out there more when we're younger to find the opportunities in life. So it would make sense.
We're trying to make our mark on the world.
Exactly. It would make sense we're more attuned to that. And then later in life, after we've gone through all the experience of life, it makes sense we're going to lean back more and be available to all the energies that come to us. And they come to our terms more guidance, more softness, more offering in that way. So you might also just notice throughout your life, there's a maturation process to these subtypes as well as an INFJ. But we want to hear from you. You're an INFJ that's been listening. You haven't had a microphone, but we do want to hear what's coming up for you as we discuss the 4 subtypes of INFJ and the different career paths they might choose. And remember, career can influence subtype and subtype can influence career. That goes both ways. So the career you choose might start to push you toward one of these subtypes, and one of these subtypes might influence the career you choose.
Right.
So what comes up for you? Come over to personalityhacker.com, directly below this episode, ask a question, leave a comment. More importantly, share your career story with us. Are you just starting out? You're almost ready to graduate university, or you just graduated, you just started your career world? Or are you further along in your career? You're ready to make a change. You don't like what you're doing and you want to change that. Or you love what you're doing and your career is perfectly tailored for you as an INFJ. What's your career story? Come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Yeah, and we'll also post a link to the resources available for Dario's work on this right now. He's created, at the time of this recording, a booklet that goes into each of the subtypes. It's really interesting, so we'll make sure to link that as well. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. It helps me out a lot because I know that I'm getting some feedback and I know what's going on. So if you wouldn't just leave a rating, but also a review, that would be awesome. You may be watching us on YouTube because we now have a video podcast version. So go over to YouTube, check it out. Joel's quite a piece of eye candy. So as I pontificate and do a bunch of talking, you can look at Joel and his lovely locks as I yammer on. And you can hit the like button, you can subscribe and click the little bell or click on the little bell in order to be made aware of when a new episode comes out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And are you in the middle of your best fit type journey? Meaning that, did you hear this podcast and start to question whether or not you do have INFJ preferences, or are you maybe starting to look at this whole thing a little different than you thought before, since there are these things called subtypes? Well, you can head over to personalityhacker.com and take our free online assessment and at least begin the journey of discovering your best fit type. Personalityhacker.com. We have an assessment there, and and you can join the fun, be made aware of when new resources and podcasts come out, and be a part of this big, huggy community.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.